If we use this list often on the screen and also on the printed page, it might be easier to read if every other row were a different color, or every fifth row, something like that, every 10th row. We can do this in a few ways. First of all, if you do convert data to a table, now you might not be familiar with that feature, but if you work with lists of data, and the list grows and shrinks, and you frequently need to sort the data, filter the data, and treat it as a unit, you can convert data to a table. Let's hold that thought for a minute and simply work with data that's not a table. This is not a table. We might want to have every fifth row highlighted differently so we can read it. And there's another worksheet over here called Scientific. Pretty boring data, and I don't understand it, but I might want to look at this too and have the same feature in effect. And it doesn't have to be 5 rows. It could be 4, 3, 10, whatever. We can change it. Let's go back to that first sheet called HR list. We do this by way of conditional formatting. I'm going to click on the upper left-hand corner. That selects the entire sheet. And right now, cell A1 is the active cell. On the Home tab, we go to Conditional Formatting. Now, this is not a built-in feature, but we can create a new rule relatively quickly by using a formula to determine which cells to format. The formula might strike you as a little unusual. It does involve a function that you might not have used. What we'd like to say in English, first of all, is if the row number is evenly divisible by 5, and that would mean 5, 10, 15, 20, etc., let's make it be a different color. And the way we do this is to use a function called mod. The mod function says, I'm going to do a calculation. And the calculation is going to be based on the row number of any cell in this worksheet. So we put in ROW, left parenthesis, right parenthesis, comma, 5 if we want every 5 rows. So what does the mod function do? It takes a value, in this case a row number, it divides it by 5, and it figures out the remainder. What's the remainder if you divide 2 by 5? The remainder is 2. The answer is 0, but we don't care about that. We're looking for the remainder. And whenever this remainder is equal to 0, that means that the row number is evenly divisible by 5. So whenever that happens, we want to change the format of a cell in that row. And of course, that means all cells in the row. And we can use bold, italic, underline, any number of different features, border features. But probably the most obvious would be fill. And pick a light color so you can see the text through it. I'll just use the yellow right here. And click OK. And click OK. And every fifth row is yellow. As we scroll up and down, we see that. And if I delete row 3, this automatically readjusts. The new fifth row, at least in terms of data, is yellow. It's always the 5th, 10th, 15th, etc., regardless of what you do with other rows. I'll undo that, Control-Z, and now Michael Adkins will move back into the 5th row, and that row is still yellow, of course. We could do the same thing with column. We can certainly change this. I'll go back to the upper left corner and go back to conditional formatting. And when you revisit a rule or come back to a rule, the choice is called Manage Rules. And then we see the rule here, we click it, and we edit the rule. So if it's every 4th row, I'll put in a 4 instead of a 5, and almost immediately, enter, enter, we see what's happening there. And just for quick reference here, if we wanted to do this by column, once again, back to conditional formatting, manage the rule, edit the rule. We just change the word row to column. I think in the example with columns, you might want to do every other column. So we put in column instead of row. Let's try that with 2. And that means every second column. Even though columns are not numbered, they do have numbers behind the scenes that we don't see. And as we click OK and OK, now every other column is yellow. Now, if you convert data to a table, and I'm going to do that with this list right here. First of all, I'll press undo. For the moment, we have no conditional formatting in effect. If we convert this to a table, you can press Control-T to start the process or Control-L. You can go to the Home tab and format as table, or go to the Insert tab, Table. Here we see a description that makes some sense. Create a table to organize and analyze related data. Choose Table, OK, and automatically we have the so-called banded row look. Now, in this example here, and in all tables and all the different variations we see, every other row has a color. And we see what's happening as we slide over some of the many variations that we see here. So here we automatically get that look, but you don't have the ability to really change it unless you take a good deal of time and create your own style. It takes a long time. So these are possibly an alternative to what we just showed earlier. And when you work with that scientific data that I showed you just briefly, here too might be a good idea. I'll do it faster this time. Control T, let's turn this into a table. That's going to be a lot easier. You have one other variation in table that's worth considering too. You can turn off banded rows and choose banded columns instead. There too, it's every other column. You don't want to choose both together. Kind of ridiculous. But certainly one or the other that way. So for reading large lists, either banded columns, but probably more likely, as we saw in the previous example, banded rows. And remember, back on this worksheet here, before we had converted it into a table, we showed you how to make every fifth row, every fourth row have a certain format by way of conditional formatting.